Margaret Westfield had built an empire on the belief that appearances mattered more than anything else. Her luxury consulting firm occupied 3 floors of Manhattan's most prestigious tower, and she'd cultivated a reputation for ruthless perfectionism. But when she decided to upgrade her staff based on their looks and wardrobes, she never expected one quiet man to challenge everything she'd built. David Hayes sat in her marble lobby with his worn jacket and scuffed shoes, clutching a manila folder that would either destroy her or save them both. What she discovered in those documents would force her to confront a truth she'd spent decades running from. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Westfield Consulting like a blade, casting long shadows across the pristine marble lobby. Margaret Westfield stood at the edge of the 32nd floor, her reflection sharp against the glass, a woman carved from ambition and tailored in Italian wool. Below, Manhattan pulsed with its usual chaos, but up here, in her domain, everything moved according to her design. Her assistant, Jennifer, approached with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to read the temperature of a room from the set of Margaret's shoulders. "The Monday morning briefing is ready, Ms. Westfield." Margaret didn't turn from the window. "Cancel it." "Ma'am?" "Cancel it. Schedule individual meetings instead, starting with HR." Jennifer hesitated, stylus hovering over her tablet. "All of them? Every department head. 15 minutes each." Margaret's voice carried the kind of certainty that had built her company from a one-room office to 3 floors of prime Manhattan real estate. "And Jennifer, have security review the access logs for the past month. I want to know who's been using the service elevators." The marble beneath Margaret's heels echoed with each step as she moved toward her corner office. The sound was sharp, deliberate, a metronome of authority that had trained her employees to measure their own pace against hers. She'd cultivated this presence over 15 years, understanding that in the consulting world, perception was everything. Clients paid premium rates not just for expertise, but for the confidence that came with entering these immaculate halls, surrounded by people who looked like they belonged in the pages of Fortune magazine. At 9:30 sharp, Robert Martinez from Human Resources knocked on her door with the tentative rhythm of a man who suspected he was walking into an execution. "Come in." Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk, without looking up from the file she was reviewing. "Close the door behind you." Robert had been with the company for 8 years, hired back when Margaret was still more concerned with credentials than appearance. He was competent, thorough, and possessed the kind of institutional memory that made him indispensable during audits. He was also, Margaret had recently noticed, showing signs of wear that didn't align with her evolving vision. His suit was off the rack, probably purchased at one of those department store sales that middle management frequented. The shoes were well maintained but clearly not Italian. And there was something about his posture, the slight forward lean of someone who'd spent too many years hunched over desk work, who took the subway instead of car service. "Robert, I need to discuss a strategic initiative with you." "Of course, Ms. Westfield." He opened his notepad. A gesture so automatic it revealed just how predictable this relationship had become. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same analytical focus she brought to client presentations. "Our client base has evolved significantly over the past 2 years. Fortune 500 companies, international conglomerates, government contracts at the highest levels. These clients make decisions worth millions based on first impressions." Robert nodded, still writing, still assuming this was about improving client relations protocols. "I've been conducting an assessment of our team's alignment with our brand image." Margaret's voice remained steady, professional. "Some adjustments need to be made." The pen stopped moving. Robert looked up, and Margaret could see the exact moment understanding began to dawn. "What kind of adjustments?" "We need team members who project success from the moment they walk into a room. People who understand that in our business, you don't just represent expertise, you embody it. Margaret pulled out a folder she'd prepared that morning. "I've identified several positions that would benefit from fresh perspectives." She slid the folder across the desk. Robert's hands were steady as he opened it, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around his eyes as he read the first name on the list, his own. "Ms. Westfield, I've been with this company for 8 years. My performance reviews have been satisfactory." Margaret's interruption was gentle but final. "This isn't about performance, Robert. This is about evolution. The company is moving in a direction that requires a different kind of representation." Robert closed the folder, his movements careful and controlled. "A different kind of representation." "Yes." "Meaning?" Margaret stood, walking to the window again. The morning sun had shifted, and the shadows had grown shorter, sharper, meaning people who look like they were born to succeed, not like they've been fighting for it. The silence stretched between them like a wire under tension. Robert remained seated, the folder in his hands, processing words that had been delivered with the same tone Margaret used to discuss quarterly projections. "And if I refuse to resign?" Margaret turned back to him, her expression unchanged. "Then we'll discuss performance improvement plans and find other reasons, but that would be messier for everyone involved." Robert stood slowly, leaving the folder on her desk. "I have a mortgage, Ms. Westfield. 2 kids in college. I'm not unsympathetic to that, Robert. The severance package is generous." Margaret returned to her chair, already signaling the end of the conversation. "HR will need to handle this efficiently. I trust you understand the importance of discretion during the transition." After Robert left, Margaret called for the next appointment. Linda from accounting arrived 7 minutes later, her sensible shoes silent on the marble. The conversation followed the same script, polite, professional, devastating. By noon, Margaret had met with 14 employees. 12 had been given folders. The ones who remained shared certain qualities. They wore their success like expensive cologne, carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from never having worried about utility bills, spoke with accents that suggested prep schools and summer homes. They were the right kind of beautiful, the right kind of polished. Margaret ate lunch at her desk while reviewing the afternoon's termination schedule. Outside her window, the city hummed with the energy of people fighting to climb higher, but from her vantage point, they looked like ants scurrying between the shadows of buildings built by people like her. Her phone buzzed, a text from her daughter Ashley, a sophomore at Columbia. "Mom, can I bring some friends to the apartment this weekend? We're working on a project about economic inequality." Margaret stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Of course. Order dinner from that place you like." She deleted the text thread and returned to her files. The afternoon brought more conversations, more folders, more carefully worded explanations about company direction and brand alignment. By 4 p.m., 23 employees had been given their walking papers. The office felt different, already lighter, Margaret told herself. More focused. Jennifer knocked at 4:30. "Ms. Westfield, there's a situation in the lobby." "What kind of situation?" "One of the terminated employees. David Hayes from IT. He's requesting a meeting with you." Margaret's jaw tightened. David Hayes had been on her list, a competent programmer whose department store wardrobe and economy car had made him an easy target. Security should have escorted him out already. They tried. "He says he has documents that you need to see before he leaves. He's being polite but persistent." Margaret rose from her chair. David Hayes. She remembered him now, always arrived early, stayed late, rarely spoke in meetings unless directly asked. The kind of employee who faded into the background until you needed something fixed, then somehow made the impossible work. "Tell security to give me 5 minutes with him. Conference room B." "Ma'am?" "5 minutes, Jennifer. Then he leaves." Conference room B was smaller than Margaret's usual meeting spaces, with a simple table and 4 chairs, no windows. She preferred it for difficult conversations. The enclosed space created pressure, encouraged quick resolution. David Hayes was waiting when she entered, a manila folder clutched in hands that showed the calluses of someone who'd once worked with them. His suit was the same off-the-rack navy she'd seen that morning, but something about his posture had changed. The resignation she'd witnessed during their earlier meeting had hardened into something else. "Mr. Hayes." Margaret remained standing, keeping the power dynamic clear. "Jennifer mentioned you had documents." David looked up at her, and Margaret was surprised by the steadiness in his eyes. "I do." He opened the folder and removed a stack of papers. "Bank statements," Margaret realized. "Loan documents, medical bills." "These are my daughter's treatment records," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "Leukemia. Diagnosed 18 months ago." Margaret felt something cold move through her chest, but her expression remained unchanged. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Hayes, but personal circumstances don't—" "She's in remission now." David's interruption was gentle but absolute. "Thanks to the insurance coverage this job provides. The treatments cost $200,000. Without this position, without this insurance." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Margaret looked down at the papers spread across the table. Medical terminology she didn't understand, numbers that made her own mortgage seem trivial. And then, at the bottom of the stack, a photograph. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, sitting in a hospital bed. She was smiling despite the feeding tube, despite the way the oversized hospital gown swallowed her thin frame. Her hair was growing back in soft patches, and her eyes held the kind of brightness that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "Her name is Emily," David said. "She wants to be a programmer like her dad." Margaret's hands remained steady as she looked at the photograph, but something inside her chest had begun to crack. The little girl looked nothing like Ashley had at that age. No expensive clothes, no private school polish, no assumption that the world would bend to accommodate her dreams, but the hope in her eyes was the same. "Mr. Hayes, I understand this is difficult. Do you?" David's question was soft, but it cut through Margaret's prepared response like a blade. "Do you understand what it's like to choose between keeping your child alive and keeping your dignity?" Margaret met his eyes, and for the first time that day she felt uncertain. "I have responsibilities to this company, to our clients, to our brand." David nodded slowly, gathering the papers back into the folder. "I know what I look like to you, Miss Westfield. I know my suit came from J.C. Penney. I know I drive a 12-year-old Honda. I know I don't fit the image you're trying to project." He stood, and Margaret was struck by how much taller he seemed than he had that morning. "But I also know that I've worked 60-hour weeks for 3 years to keep this company's servers running. I know that I've solved problems that saved you millions in downtime, and I know that my daughter's life depends on the health insurance you're about to take away because I don't look successful enough." Margaret watched him move toward the door, her mind racing through calculations, legal liability, public relations risk, the cost of replacing his institutional knowledge. "Mr. Hayes." He stopped, hand on the door handle. "Sit down." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then David returned to his chair, the folder still clutched in his hands. Margaret remained standing, but something fundamental had shifted in the room. The power dynamic she'd built her career on felt suddenly fragile, like ice beginning to crack under spring sun. "Tell me about the other employees you mentioned," she said. "Ma'am? This morning you said others were affected. Tell me about them." David's expression remained guarded, but he opened the folder again. "Maria Santos, from reception. Single mother, 2 kids. Roberto Martinez, from HR, his son just started at community college. Linda, from accounting, her husband's been out of work for 6 months." Margaret listened to the litany of lives disrupted, of careful budgets destroyed, of dreams deferred. Each name came with a story, each story with consequences that rippled far beyond her pristine offices. "And you think that changes the business reality?" she asked. David was quiet for a long moment. "I think it changes what kind of person you want to be." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret found herself thinking of Ashley's text message of economic inequality projects and dinner orders that cost more than some people made in a day. "Give me the folder," she said. David hesitated, then slid it across the table. Margaret opened it, looking again at the medical bills, the bank statements, the photograph of a little girl who wanted to be a programmer. "Wait here," she said. Margaret walked back to her office with David's folder pressed against her chest, each step echoing differently, now less like a metronome of authority, more like the irregular rhythm of someone whose certainty had begun to fracture. Jennifer looked up as she passed. "Ms. Westfield?" "Is everything—" "Hold my calls." Margaret's voice came out rougher than intended. "And cancel the rest of today's termination meetings." "Cancel them? Postpone them. Tell the department heads we're reviewing the restructuring timeline." Margaret closed her office door and placed David's folder on her desk next to the neat stack of termination packages she'd prepared that morning. The contrast was jarring, her crisp manila folders labeled with employee names and severance calculations, and David's worn folder containing the weight of a child's life. She opened her laptop and pulled up David Hayes's personnel file, 3 years with the company. Consistently high performance reviews. Multiple commendations for going above and beyond during system crises. The kind of employee who made other people's jobs easier by simply being competent and reliable. His salary was $67,000 annually. Not poverty, but in Manhattan, with medical bills and a daughter to support. Margaret found herself calculating expenses she'd never had to consider. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, probably $200 a month. Health insurance premiums, even with company coverage. Groceries, utilities, transportation. The mathematics of survival she'd never needed to learn. Her phone buzzed. Ashley again. "Mom, my friend Sophia is doing her thesis on corporate social responsibility. Can I bring her to dinner sometime? She'd love to pick your brain about ethical business practices." Margaret stared at the message until the screen went dark. She walked to her window, but instead of looking out at the city, she found herself studying her own reflection. At 43, she'd achieved everything she'd dreamed of at 23. The corner office, the 7-figure salary, the apartment on the Upper East Side. She'd built herself into exactly the kind of woman she'd wanted to become: successful, influential, untouchable. But David Hayes's question echoed in her mind. "Do you understand what it's like to choose between keeping your child alive and keeping your dignity?" No, she didn't. Margaret had never had to choose between anything meaningful. When Ashley was born, the best pediatricians had been a phone call away. Private schools, tutors, summer programs, every opportunity had been available simply because Margaret had made enough money to purchase them. The idea of rationing medical care, of choosing between treatment and rent, was as foreign to her as speaking Mandarin. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Jennifer entered with a cup of coffee, Margaret's usual afternoon ritual. "The postponed meetings are rescheduled for tomorrow morning." "Should I—" "Jennifer, how long have you been with the company?" The question seemed to surprise her assistant. 2 years next month, Ms. Westfield. "And before that?" "I worked at a non-profit downtown, housing advocacy." Jennifer paused, seeming to sense that this wasn't small talk. "Why do you ask? Did you know any of the employees who were terminated today? Personally, I mean." Jennifer's carefully maintained professional expression flickered. "Some of them, yes." "Tell me about Maria Santos." A longer pause. Jennifer set down the coffee cup and clasped her hands in front of her. "Maria has worked reception for 5 years. She knows every client by name, remembers their preferences. Her son, Miguel, is in his senior year of high school. He's been accepted to 3 colleges, but they're waiting to see what financial aid comes through." Margaret nodded for her to continue. "Roberto Martinez coaches Little League on weekends. He's the one who organized the office fundraiser when the Johnson account team got stuck in that blizzard last winter. And Linda," Jennifer's voice softened, Linda's husband was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's last year. She's been the sole income for their family while taking care of him. Each name came with a story. Each story revealed connections Margaret had never bothered to notice, the web of relationships and dependencies that existed beneath the surface of her carefully orchestrated business environment. "Why didn't I know any of this?" Margaret asked. Jennifer considered the question carefully. "You never asked, Ms. Westfield." The honesty was gentle but absolute. Margaret realized that in 15 years of building this company, she'd learned the names of every major client, memorized their preferences and profit margins, but had never bothered to learn the basic human details of the people who made those relationships possible. "I need you to do something for me," Margaret said. "Compile a list of everyone who was terminated today, not just their positions and salaries. I want to know about their families, their circumstances, their stories." Jennifer's eyebrows lifted slightly. "All of them?" "All of them. And Jennifer, do it quietly. Don't mention it to anyone else yet." After Jennifer left, Margaret found herself unable to focus on anything else. She tried reviewing client proposals, returning emails, preparing for the next day's presentations, but David Hayes's folder kept drawing her attention back. She opened it again and studied the photograph of his daughter, Emily. 8 years old, fighting leukemia, dreaming of becoming a programmer. The kind of dreams Margaret had never had to worry about protecting. Her phone rang. "Ms. Westfield? David Hayes is still in conference room B. Security is asking if they should escort him out." Margaret looked at her watch. It had been over an hour since she'd left him there. "No, tell him I'll be down in a few minutes." "Ma'am?" "And tell security they can stand down." Margaret gathered David's folder and walked back to conference room B, her heels echoing in the hallway with that familiar, sharp rhythm. But now it sounded different to her ears, less like authority, more like distance. David was sitting exactly where she'd left him, hands folded on the table, expression patient but watchful. He looked up when she entered but didn't speak. Margaret sat down across from him. The first time all day she'd positioned herself at the same level as someone she was speaking with. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. David waited. "About choosing between your child's life and your dignity." Margaret set the folder on the table between them. "You're right. I don't understand that choice. I've never had to make it." "Most people haven't," David said quietly. "That doesn't make you a bad person." Margaret was surprised by the generosity in his voice. After the morning she'd put him through, she'd expected anger, resentment, the kind of bitterness that came from being dismissed for circumstances beyond his control. "It might make me a bad leader." David considered this. "What kind of leader do you want to be?" The question was so simple it felt dangerous. Margaret realized that for years she'd focused on what kind of company she wanted to build, what kind of success she wanted to achieve, what kind of image she wanted to project. But she'd never asked herself what kind of person she wanted to be while doing it. "Tell me about the others," she said instead. David's expression softened. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What they're facing, what this means for them. Help me understand what I've done." For the next hour, David painted portraits of lives Margaret had never bothered to see. Roberto, who'd worked his way up from the mailroom and was the first person in his family to earn a management position. Linda, who'd been quietly covering for coworkers while managing her husband's deteriorating condition. Maria, who'd learned English by watching business news and could now handle international clients with more grace than some of the college-educated account managers. Each story revealed not just individual struggles, but the complex ecosystem of support and interdependence that Margaret had been unknowingly dismantling. "They're not just employees," David said as he finished describing the last terminated worker. "They're the foundation that everything else is built on. The people who stay late to fix problems, who remember the small details that matter, who care about this place because they need it to care about them back." Margaret found herself thinking about her own foundation, the nanny who'd raised Ashley while Margaret built her career, the housekeeper who'd maintained their home, the driver who'd navigated the city while Margaret worked in the back seat. All the invisible labor that had made her success possible. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. David was quiet for a long moment. "I think you should ask yourself what kind of company you're really trying to build. One that looks successful or one that actually is successful. What's the difference? One is about appearances. The other is about people." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. "Mom, quick question, is it true that some companies fire people just because they don't look rich enough? Sophia was telling me about this case study, and it seems so dystopian." Margaret stared at the message, her daughter's words hitting her like cold water. "Mr. Hayes," she said slowly, "what would it take for you to stay?" David's eyebrows rose. "Stay? With the company? What would it take for you to withdraw your resignation and continue working here?" "I never submitted a resignation." Margaret blinked. "But this morning you gave me a folder and told me I didn't fit your brand image. You suggested I resign to avoid messier alternatives." David's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "I never agreed to any of it." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. In her mind, she'd been graciously reconsidering a decision that had already been made. But legally, professionally, she'd simply threatened an employee's job based on his appearance and economic status. "Oh God," she whispered. David watched her process the implications, the lawsuit potential, the discrimination claims, the public relations nightmare that could destroy everything she'd built. "Miss Hayes, Ms. Westfield." His interruption was gentle but firm. "I'm not interested in destroying you or this company. I'm interested in keeping my daughter alive, and maybe, if I'm lucky, keeping some small amount of dignity while I do it." Margaret met his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected, not anger or resentment, but a kind of weary hope. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I want you to be better than you were this morning." The simplicity of it was devastating. Not revenge, not compensation, not public humiliation, just the chance for her to choose differently. Margaret's hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. "Jennifer, I need you to contact everyone who was terminated today. All of them. Tell them there's been a significant change in the restructuring plan and ask them to come in tomorrow morning for individual meetings. All of them, Ms. Westfield. All of them. And, Jennifer, clear my schedule for the rest of the week." After she hung up, Margaret looked back at David. "That's a start. But I need to understand something. Why are you giving me this chance? After what I put you through today, why aren't you filing a lawsuit or calling the media?" David picked up the folder containing his daughter's medical records. "Because Emily asked me what I do at work, and I told her I help fix things that are broken. I'd like that to still be true tomorrow." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, a space she hadn't even realized had been sealed shut. "Will you help me?" she asked. "Help you what?" "Fix what's broken." David studied her for a long moment, and Margaret could see him weighing her sincerity against the morning's cruelty, measuring hope against the practical reality of protecting his family. "I'll try," he said finally, "but it's going to require more than just undoing today's mistakes." "What do you mean?" David stood, gathering his papers. "It's going to require you to see us, really see us, not as liabilities or assets or brand representatives, but as people with lives that matter as much as your clients' profit margins." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. "There's something else," David said as he reached the door. "The others, the ones you terminated today, they're going to need more than just their jobs back. They're going to need to trust that this won't happen again the next time you decide appearances matter more than competence." He left Margaret sitting alone in conference room B, surrounded by the echoes of a day that had started with such certainty and had ended with everything she thought she knew about success crumbling around her. Outside the conference room windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In a few hours, David Hayes would go home to his daughter, maybe help her with homework, maybe read her a story before bed. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a world where her father still had health insurance, still had a job, still had hope. Margaret realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd read Ashley a bedtime story. Margaret's apartment felt different when she arrived home that evening. The same cream-colored walls, the same carefully curated artwork, the same view of Central Park that had once made her feel like she'd conquered the world. But tonight, the silence felt hollow rather than peaceful. She found Ashley in the Kit Hayes, textbooks spread across the marble island, laptop open to what appeared to be a research paper. "Hey, Mom." Ashley looked up with the distracted smile of someone deep in academic thought. "How was your day?" Margaret poured herself a glass of wine and sat down across from her daughter. For the first time in months, she really looked at Ashley, not just the dutiful maternal check-in, but actually saw her. At 19, Ashley had Margaret's sharp features but softer edges, intelligence that hadn't yet calcified into cynicism. "Challenging," Margaret said finally. "What are you working on?" "That project I mentioned about economic inequality. We're analyzing case studies of corporate decision-making and its impact on working families." Ashley's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm Margaret remembered from her own college years. "Did you know that in some companies, a single restructuring decision can affect hundreds of families? Like kids who can't go to college, people who lose their homes, medical treatments that get postponed." Margaret's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. "Is that what your thesis is about?" "Part of it. Sophia, my friend, I mentioned she's looking at companies that have found ways to balance profit with social responsibility. Companies that see their employees as stakeholders, not just expenses." Ashley pulled up a document on her laptop. "Actually, there's this one case study about a consulting firm in Manhattan that completely transformed their approach to human resources." Margaret leaned forward, curious despite herself. "What did they do?" Well, the CEO realized that firing people based on appearance or economic status wasn't just morally wrong, it was bad business. They were losing institutional knowledge, damaging morale, creating legal liability. Ashley's fingers flew across the keyboard. So they implemented this whole new framework that measured success differently. Instead of just looking at quarterly profits, they tracked employee retention, community impact, long-term sustainability. And it worked? According to their 5-year analysis, yes. Revenue increased, client satisfaction improved, and they became a model for other firms. Ashley looked up at her mother. The interesting part is that the transformation started with one employee who refused to accept their termination. Someone from IT who had a sick child and couldn't afford to lose his health insurance. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down her wineglass. What happened to him? He became their chief technology officer. And his daughter, she recovered and ended up studying computer science. She's now leading their digital innovation team. Ashley's smile was radiant. "It's like a perfect example of how doing the right thing can also be the smart thing, you know?" Margaret stared at her daughter, mind reeling. "Ashley, what's the name of this consulting firm?" "Westfield Consulting." Ashley's expression suddenly shifted to confusion as she registered her mother's expression. "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the park. The city lights blurred as her eyes filled with tears she didn't expect. "Mom, that case study," Margaret said without turning around. "When was it written?" "It's theoretical. We're using real companies as models but creating hypothetical scenarios to explore different outcomes." Ashley's voice was uncertain now. "Mom, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" Margaret turned back to face her daughter. "What if I told you that the CEO in your case study was me? And that instead of transforming the company, I spent today firing people because they didn't look successful enough?" The color drained from Ashley's face. "What? What if I told you that there really was an IT employee with a sick daughter and that I gave him a termination folder this morning because his suit came from JCPenney? Ashley's laptop slid closed with a soft snap. Please tell me you're joking. Margaret walked back to the island and sat down heavily. I'm not joking. His name is David Hayes. His daughter Emily is 8 years old and in remission from leukemia. And this morning, I told him he didn't fit our brand image. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Ashley's eyes, so much like Margaret's own, filled with a disappointment that cut deeper than any business failure ever had. Why? Ashley's voice was barely a whisper. Because I convinced myself that appearances mattered more than people. Because I thought success meant surrounding myself with people who looked like they'd never struggled. Margaret's voice cracked. Because I forgot what it felt like to be human. Ashley pushed back from the counter, pacing to the window and back. Do you know how many conversations I've had defending you? How many times I've told people that just because you're successful doesn't mean you're heartless? Her voice rose with each word. I've been writing papers about corporate social responsibility while my own mother was... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I know. Do you? Do you really know what you've done? Ashley's composure finally cracked. That man's daughter Emily, she could have died if you'd taken away their insurance. People could have lost their homes, their futures, their hope, and for what? So your lobby looks more impressive? Margaret had faced angry clients, hostile board meetings, devastating market downturns, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of her daughter's moral judgment. I can fix this, she said. Can you? Ashley's laugh was bitter. How do you fix the trauma of being told you're not good enough because you're not rich enough? How do you fix the message you sent to everyone else in that company about what matters? Margaret had no answer. Ashley grabbed her laptop and books. I need to think about this. I need to. She stopped at the Kit Hayes doorway. I need to figure out how I'm supposed to respect someone who would do something like that. After Ashley left, Margaret sat alone in her pristine Kit Hayes, surrounded by the artifacts of a success that suddenly felt meaningless. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found David Hayes's number. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Hello? Mr. Hayes, this is Margaret Westfield. I'm sorry to call so late. It's okay. Is everything all right? Margaret almost laughed at the question. Nothing was all right. Everything she thought she'd built, everything she thought she was, had collapsed in the space of a single day. I wanted to ask you something, she said. Your daughter Emily, what does she think you do for work? There was a pause. She thinks I solve problems, fix things that are broken so people can do their jobs better. And what do you tell her about me? About the company? Another pause, longer this time. I tell her that some problems are harder to fix than others, but that doesn't mean they're not worth fixing. Margaret closed her eyes. Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you a favor. What kind of favor? Tomorrow, when you come in, when we meet with the others, I need you to help me understand not just what I did wrong, but how to do better. How to be better? Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think I've forgotten how to see people as more than spreadsheet entries. Ms. Westfield, are you sure you want to hear what that might involve? No, Margaret admitted, but I think I need to hear it anyway. David was quiet for a moment. Okay, but if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. No half measures, no PR band-aids, real change. What does that mean? It means you're going to have to give up some of the control you've spent 15 years accumulating. It means listening to people you've never bothered to hear. It means accepting that sometimes the right decision isn't the profitable decision. David's voice was gentle but unwavering. Are you prepared for that? Margaret looked around her empty Kit Hayes, thought about Ashley's disappointment, about Emily Hayes fighting for her life, about Maria Santos waiting to hear if her son could go to college. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'd like to try. After they hung up, Margaret walked through her apartment, seeing it differently. The expensive furniture, the designer fixtures, the carefully chosen art. All of it suddenly felt like a museum exhibit titled, "What Happens When Success Becomes Isolation." She stopped at Ashley's bedroom door, knocked softly, and entered when she heard a muffled, "Come in." Ashley was sitting on her bed, laptop open, but she wasn't working. She was staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone trying to reconcile irreconcilable things. "Can we talk?" Margaret asked. Margaret sat down, feeling like she was 15 years old again, called to account for some transgression. "I keep thinking about all the times you taught me that actions have consequences," Ashley said without looking at her mother. "That how we treat people matters, that success without integrity is just greed with good marketing." Margaret winced. "I remember. So what happened? When did you decide those lessons didn't apply to you?" It was a fair question. Margaret tried to trace the path that had led her from the idealistic young lawyer who'd started this company to the woman who'd spent the morning destroying lives for cosmetic reasons. "I think it happened gradually," she said finally. "Client by client, deal by deal, I started believing that the ends justified the means. That as long as the company was successful, the methods didn't matter as much. But they do matter. Yes, they do." Ashley finally looked at her. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Tomorrow, I'm going to meet with everyone I terminated today. I'm going to apologize, offer them their positions back, and ask them to help me build something better. And if they say no, then I'll have learned something important about consequences." Ashley nodded slowly. "There's something else you need to know." "What's that?" "That case study I was telling you about, the hypothetical transformation? Sophia and I didn't just make it up. We modeled it on real companies that have made similar changes." Ashley pulled up her laptop. "Companies that realized their employees were their most important asset, not their biggest expense." Margaret leaned forward to look at the screen. Ashley had compiled a list of businesses that had transformed their cultures, their practices, their fundamental approach to human resources. The results were striking: not just improved employee satisfaction, but increased innovation, better client relationships, stronger financial performance over time. "It's possible," Ashley said quietly. "What you want to do, it's actually possible, but it requires you to mean it." Margaret studied her daughter's face, seeing the careful hope there, the willingness to believe that people could change, that systems could improve, that tomorrow could be genuinely different from today. "I mean it," she said. Ashley closed the laptop and looked directly at her mother. "Then prove it." That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about David Hayes's question, "What kind of leader do you want to be?" For 15 years, she'd been the kind of leader who commanded through intimidation, who measured success in quarterly reports, who believed that distance created authority. She'd built a company that looked impressive from the outside, but had forgotten to build one that felt meaningful from the inside. Tomorrow, she would try to become a different kind of leader. The kind who listened more than she spoke, who saw people as complex beings rather than simple resources, who understood that true success was measured not just in profit margins, but in human flourishing. She thought about Emily Hayes, 8 years old and dreaming of becoming a programmer. In Ashley's hypothetical case study, Emily had grown up to lead the company's digital innovation team. In Margaret's reality, Emily was just a sick little girl whose father had almost lost his job for the crime of not looking wealthy enough. But maybe if Margaret could find the courage to change, if the people she'd hurt could find the grace to forgive, if the company could evolve into something worthy of the trust placed in it, maybe Emily's dreams could still become real. Maybe they all could. Outside her window, Manhattan continued its restless dance of ambition and hope. Somewhere in the city, David Hayes was probably checking on his daughter, making sure her medications were organized for the next day, maybe reading her a story about a future where problems could be solved and broken things could be fixed. Margaret closed her eyes and for the first time in years, allowed herself to hope that tomorrow could be different. Margaret arrived at the office an hour before her usual time, but David Hayes was already there. She found him in the lobby, not sitting in one of the leather chairs reserved for visitors, but standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up. His reflection in the glass looked smaller than she remembered, but somehow steadier. "You're early," she said. David turned. In the morning light, she could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the kind that came from sleepless nights spent weighing impossible choices. "I wanted to make sure I was ready." "Ready for what?" "To help you keep your promise." Margaret felt the weight of that simple statement. Yesterday had been about her awakening to the damage she'd caused. Today would be about whether she had the courage to actually repair it. "The others, are they coming?" David nodded toward the elevator bank. "Maria Santos is already here. She came in early to prepare the conference room. Roberto Martinez will be here at 8:30, and the rest throughout the morning." He paused. "They're scared, Ms. Westfield. Scared and angry and confused. Yesterday they thought they understood how the world worked, and then you changed the rules without warning." Margaret looked around the pristine lobby, marble floors that reflected the morning sun, fresh orchids that were replaced twice a week, furniture that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. She'd designed this space to intimidate, to establish hierarchy before a word was spoken. "Where should we meet?" she asked. "Not in conference room B, too small, too formal, and not in your office, too much imbalance." David considered the space. "What about here, in the lobby?" "Here? Open space, natural light, equal footing. No one sitting higher than anyone else." Margaret looked around the lobby with new eyes. It would mean giving up the controlled environment she'd cultivated, the psychological advantages she'd built into every business interaction. It would mean meeting as equals rather than as superior to subordinate. "All right." David pulled out his phone. "I'll let the others know." By 9 o'clock, 15 people had gathered in a rough circle around the lobby's seating area. Margaret recognized all their faces, but realized with shame that she knew very few of their stories. Maria Santos sat with her hands folded, her usual warm demeanor replaced by careful wariness. Roberto Martinez kept checking his watch, probably calculating how much work time he was losing, how far behind this would put him. Margaret had prepared remarks, but facing the group people whose lives she'd disrupted with the casual cruelty of a spreadsheet decision, the words felt inadequate. "I asked you all here," she began, then stopped, started again. "Yesterday, I made decisions that were wrong. Not just professionally wrong, but morally wrong, and I want to understand how to make them right." Linda from accounting shifted in her chair. "With respect, Ms. Westfield, you can't just unmake what happened yesterday. You can't take back the moment you told us we weren't good enough for your company because we don't look rich enough." The directness of it was like a slap. Margaret had expected anger, but this quiet dignity was somehow harder to bear. "You're right," Margaret said. "I can't take it back. But I can try to understand why I thought it was acceptable in the first place." "Why does that matter now?" asked James from marketing, a man whose 10 years of service had earned him exactly 15 minutes in Margaret's termination schedule. "Understanding your motivation doesn't change the fact that you were willing to destroy our livelihoods for cosmetic reasons." Margaret felt the impulse to defend herself, to explain the business pressures, the client expectations, the competitive environment that had led to her decision. But David's words from the day before stopped her. "It's going to require you to see us, really see us." "It matters," she said slowly, "because if I don't understand how I became the kind of person who could make those decisions, I might make them again." Maria Santos spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of 5 years of watching Margaret from the reception desk. "You became that person gradually, Ms. Westfield. Every time you walked past without saying hello. Every time you treated us like furniture instead of people. Every time you made decisions about us without talking to us." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Margaret realized that yesterday's terminations hadn't been an aberration, they'd been the logical conclusion of years of incremental dehumanization. "Tell me how," she said. "How what?" "Tell me how I stopped seeing you as people. Help me understand the process so I can reverse it." Roberto Martinez leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Why should we help you figure out how to be a decent human being? Shouldn't that be something you already know?" It was a fair question, and Margaret didn't have a good answer for it. She looked around the circle of faces, people who had every right to walk away, to file lawsuits, to expose her behavior to the media and watch her career crumble. Instead, they were here, sitting in her lobby at 9 in the morning, willing to engage with the person who had nearly destroyed their security for the crime of not looking successful enough. "You're right," she said finally. "You shouldn't have to teach me basic decency. But you're the only ones who can help me understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of my decisions." David Hayes, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "Ms. Westfield, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you fired us yesterday, what did you see when you looked at us?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Yesterday felt like a lifetime ago, but she could still remember her thought process, the cold calculations that had seemed so rational at the time. "I saw liabilities," she said quietly. "People who didn't project the image I wanted for the company. Problems to be solved rather than—" She trailed off, the rest of the sentence too damning to finish. "Rather than what?" Maria prompted gently. "Rather than human beings with lives that mattered." The admission seemed to shift something in the room. Not forgiveness that would take much more, but acknowledgement that Margaret was at least capable of seeing the magnitude of what she'd done. Linda spoke again, her voice softer now, but still carrying an edge of pain. "Do you know what it's like to go home and tell your family that you've been fired because you're not attractive enough for your job? Do you know what that does to a person's sense of worth?" Margaret shook her head. "My husband, he's sick, and some days he doesn't recognize me. But yesterday, when I told him I'd been let go, he had one of his clear moments. And he looked at me and said, 'But Linda, you're beautiful.' As if that should have been enough to save my job." Linda's voice cracked. "And I had to explain to a man with Alzheimer's that in your world his opinion of me doesn't matter because I don't look like I belong in a magazine." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret felt something breaking apart inside her chest, not just guilt, but a fundamental reconstruction of how she understood cause and effect, action and consequence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Sorry doesn't pay my mortgage," said James. "Sorry doesn't explain to my daughter why Daddy might not be able to afford her college tuition." Margaret nodded, accepting the anger, the hurt, the practical realities that apologies couldn't address. What would? What would actually help? David leaned forward. Real change. Not just policy changes or PR initiatives, but fundamental transformation in how this company operates. "What does that look like?" "It starts with giving us our jobs back," Roberto said. "All of us. With full benefits restored and no retaliation." "Done." "It continues," Maria added, "with you understanding that we're not interchangeable parts. We're people with families, with dreams, with knowledge and skills that took years to develop." Margaret nodded. "I'm beginning to understand that." "Are you?" Linda's question was gentle but pointed, because understanding it intellectually and actually living it are different things. David stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city beyond. "Ms. Westfield, can I tell you what Emily said to me last night?" Margaret felt her throat tighten. "What did she say?" "She asked me if the mean lady at my work was going to make me sad forever." David's reflection in the glass seemed to shimmer. An 8-year-old child was worried about her father's emotional well-being because his boss treated him like he was disposable. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought of Ashley's disappointed face, of the case study that painted a hypothetical future where companies chose humanity over image. "What did you tell her?" David turned back to face the group. I told her that sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes they learn from them, and sometimes they become better because of what they've learned. He paused. I told her we'd have to wait and see which kind of person you turned out to be. Margaret looked around the circle of faces, people she'd reduced to termination folders, now offering her a chance at redemption she didn't deserve but desperately needed. I want to be the kind of person who learns, she said, but I don't know how to do this alone. You won't be alone, David said quietly. If you mean it, really mean it, we'll help you build something better. Margaret felt tears she hadn't expected, relief mixed with terror at the magnitude of the change she was committing to. What's the first step? Maria Santos stood, smoothing her skirt with a gesture Margaret had seen 1,000 times at the reception desk but never really noticed. The first step is listening. Really listening. To all of us, not just when there's a crisis. Roberto nodded. The second step is transparency. No more decisions about us made without us. If this company is going to change, we need to be part of designing that change. And the third step, Linda added with the first smile Margaret had seen from her all morning, is accepting that sometimes the people who look the least like success know the most about what it actually takes to achieve it. David returned to his seat in the circle. Are you ready for that, Ms. Westfield? Margaret looked around at the faces of people she'd almost destroyed, people who were offering her a path to redemption despite having every reason to walk away. I don't know if I'm ready, she said honestly, but I'm willing to try. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan was fully awake, now millions of people pursuing their own versions of success, their own definitions of what it meant to matter. Margaret had spent 15 years believing that success meant rising above those people, insulating herself from their struggles and limitations. Now she was beginning to understand that true success might mean something entirely different, building something worthy of the trust these people were offering her, creating a company that elevated everyone instead of just the person at the top. Then, let's begin, David said. And in the pristine lobby of Westfield Consulting, surrounded by marble and orchids and the artifacts of a success built on distance and control, Margaret Westfield began the most important education of her life. Learning how to see the people she'd forgotten how to notice. Part 5, 6 months later, Margaret stood in the same spot by the floor-to-ceiling windows, but everything had changed. The lobby still gleamed with marble and fresh orchids, but now it hummed with a different kind of energy. Maria Santos was at the reception desk, but instead of the careful deference Margaret had grown accustomed to, Maria moved with the confidence of someone whose opinions mattered, whose insights were valued. A small plaque had been installed near the elevator bank, Westfield Consulting, Building Success Together. It had been David's idea, though the entire team had voted on the wording. Margaret had learned to appreciate the irony. The most important changes in her company had come from collaborative decisions rather than executive mandates. Ms. Westfield? Jennifer's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. The quarterly review meeting is ready. Margaret nodded, gathering the folder that contained not just financial reports but employee satisfaction surveys, community impact assessments, and long-term sustainability metrics. The data told a story that would have surprised her former self. Treating people as human beings rather than overhead expenses had actually improved the bottom line. The conference room buzzed with conversation as Margaret entered. David was explaining something technical to Roberto, who now served as employee liaison in addition to his HR duties. Linda was reviewing financial projections with 2 junior analysts, both recent hires, whose qualifications mattered more than their wardrobes. Maria was taking notes on her tablet, preparing to present the client feedback report she'd been compiling. This was the new leadership team, and Margaret still felt a flutter of anxiety when she realized how much decision-making power she'd distributed. But the results spoke for themselves. Employee retention was up 400%, client satisfaction had reached all-time highs, And the company had been featured in 3 business journals as an example of successful organizational transformation. "Good morning, everyone," Margaret said, taking her seat at the table, not at the head, but in the middle, part of the circle rather than separate from it. "Good morning, Margaret," came the chorus of replies. It had taken her months to get used to hearing her first name in professional settings, but David had insisted that hierarchy shouldn't be performed through titles when it wasn't necessary for function. David opened his laptop and projected the quarterly metrics onto the wall screen. Overall, Q2 exceeded our projections across all measured categories. Client retention is at 97%. We've added 4 new major accounts, and our employee satisfaction scores have remained consistently above industry standards. Margaret felt the familiar spark of pride, but it was different now, pride in what they had built together rather than what she had achieved alone. "The interesting development," Maria continued, "is that our reputation transformation has become a competitive advantage. 3 clients specifically mentioned choosing us because of our company culture. They want to work with organizations that align with their own values." Roberto shuffled his papers. "We've also had 7 applications from senior-level consultants at competitor firms. They're interested in working for a company that, quote, treats its people like human beings rather than billable hour generators." Margaret smiled. "Any concerns or challenges we need to address?" Linda raised her hand slightly, a gesture that would have been unnecessary in the old hierarchy, but had become part of their collaborative rhythm. "Actually, yes. We're growing faster than anticipated, which is wonderful, but it's putting strain on our support systems. We need to hire more staff, but we also need to maintain the culture we've built. How do we scale humanity?" It was a good problem to have, but a real one nonetheless. Margaret looked around the table, waiting to see who would offer solutions rather than jumping in with her own ideas. David leaned back in his chair. "What if we made cultural fit part of the interview process? Not in the superficial way it's usually applied, but actually assessing whether candidates can thrive in an environment where collaboration matters more than individual achievement? And we could implement a mentorship program," Maria suggested. "Pair new hires with existing team members who can help them understand not just what we do, but how we do it." Margaret found herself taking notes rather than leading the discussion, marveling at how much more creative the solutions became when they emerged from the people who would actually implement them. "There's something else we should discuss," Roberto said, his tone shifting slightly. "We've been invited to present our transformation model at the National Business Ethics Conference." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "That's..." "It is. They want to showcase companies that have successfully changed their fundamental operating principles. The presentation would be about our journey from appearance-based decision-making to values-based leadership." The room fell quiet. Everyone knew what this meant. Margaret would have to stand in front of hundreds of business leaders and admit to the failures that had precipitated their transformation. She would have to tell the story of the worst day of her professional life and explain how it had become the catalyst for the best changes she'd ever made. "Would you be comfortable with that level of public disclosure?" Linda asked gently. Margaret considered the question. 6 months ago, the idea of admitting professional failure in such a public forum would have been unthinkable. Her reputation, her image, her carefully constructed professional persona, all of it would be vulnerable to scrutiny and judgment. But looking around this table, at people who had trusted her with their second chances and taught her what leadership actually meant, she realized that protecting her image mattered less than protecting the changes they'd built together. "If you think our story can help other companies avoid the mistakes I made," she said, "then yes, I'm comfortable with it." David's smile was small but meaningful. "Emily would be proud to hear you say that." The mention of David's daughter brought warmth to Margaret's chest. She'd met Emily twice now, once at the company picnic they'd instituted, and once when David had brought her to the office on a school holiday. The little girl was thriving, her hair fully grown back, her eyes bright with the confidence of someone whose future felt secure again. "How is Emily doing?" Margaret asked. "She starts coding camp next week. She's been practicing on the computer we set up at home, and yesterday she built her first simple game." David's pride was evident. "She told me she wants to work here someday. Help fix the broken things that keep people from doing their best work." Margaret felt that familiar crack in her chest, the place where her old certainties had broken apart to make room for something more complex and more human. "I hope we're worthy of her by the time she's ready." "We will be," Maria said with quiet confidence, "because we're not done changing yet." After the meeting ended, Margaret found herself walking through the office floors, something she'd begun doing regularly. Not the performative executive presence she'd once cultivated, but genuine curiosity about the work being done and the people doing it. She stopped at David's desk, where he was reviewing code on one monitor while troubleshooting a client issue on another. The complexity of his work had always been invisible to her before she'd seen only the external markers of his economic status, not the intellectual sophistication that made him indispensable to their operations. "David, can I ask you something?" He looked up from his screens. "Of course. That day 6 months ago, when you refused to leave the lobby, you could have destroyed me. Filed discrimination complaints, called the media, made sure I never worked in this industry again." Margaret pulled up a chair, sitting at his level rather than standing over him. "Why didn't you?" David was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Do you remember what I told Emily that night? About people making mistakes and learning from them?" Margaret nodded. "I believe that about you. Even when you were at your worst, even when you were treating us like disposable objects, I could see something in you that wanted to be better." David saved his work and turned to face her fully. "Emily asked me once why I didn't just get a different job, work for someone nicer, and I realized that if I walked away, nothing would change. You'd hire another programmer, treat them just as badly, and the cycle would continue. So you stayed to change me?" "I stayed because someone had to believe you could change. And because Emily deserves to grow up in a world where people try to be better, instead of just walking away from problems." Margaret felt the weight of that trust. The responsibility of living up to the faith David had placed in her transformation. "Do you think I have? Changed, I mean?" David's answer came without hesitation. "You're asking me that question instead of telling me you have. That's how I know you have." That evening, Margaret walked into her apartment to find Ashley in the kit haze, but this time she wasn't alone. A young woman with warm eyes and an easy smile was helping her prepare dinner, both of them laughing about something Margaret had missed. "Mom, you're home early." Ashley's face lit up with genuine pleasure rather than dutiful acknowledgement. "This is Sophia, the friend I mentioned." Margaret extended her hand to the young woman who had written hypothetical case studies about companies that chose humanity over image. "Sophia, it's wonderful to meet you. Ashley's told me so much about your research." Sophia shook her hand with a firm grip and direct eye contact. "Ms. Westfield, I have to say when Ashley told me what you've accomplished at your company over the past 6 months, I could hardly believe it. The transformation you've achieved is exactly what we've been studying in our program." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I can't take credit for the transformation. That was a collaborative effort with people far wiser than me." "But you made it possible," Sophia insisted. "You had the courage to admit when you were wrong and the humility to learn from the people you'd hurt. That's incredibly rare in corporate leadership." Ashley beamed at her mother with the kind of pride Margaret had always wanted to earn, but had never known how to achieve. "Mom, Sophia wants to interview you for her thesis. Would you be okay with that?" Margaret looked at these two young women, brilliant, idealistic, determined to build a better version of the world they were inheriting, and felt a responsibility that went beyond quarterly reports and client satisfaction scores. "I'd be honored," she said, "but I have one condition." "What's that?" Sophia asked. "I want David Hayes and the rest of my team to be part of the interview. The real story isn't about my transformation, it's about what happens when people choose to see each other as fully human. Later that night, after Sophia had gone home and Ashley had retreated to her room to work on her own projects, Margaret stood at her Kit Hayes window looking out at the city lights. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Emily's coding camp sent home her first assignment. She built a program that helps people find jobs based on their skills instead of their appearance. Thought you'd want to see it. Attached was a screenshot of simple but elegant code and a note in a child's handwriting. For Margaret, who helped my dad keep his job and taught me that broken things can be fixed. Margaret saved the screenshot and set it as her phone's wallpaper, replacing the image of her company's logo that had been there for years. Outside her window, Manhattan hummed with its eternal promise of reinvention, of second chances, of the possibility that tomorrow could be fundamentally different from yesterday. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret felt like she was part of that promise rather than separate from it. In 6 months, she would stand on a stage and tell hundreds of business leaders about the worst decision she'd ever made and the best education she'd ever received. She would talk about David Hayes and Emily's courage, about Maria Santos and the wisdom that came from truly listening, about Roberto Martinez and the power of shared leadership. But tonight, she was simply a woman who had learned to see the people she'd forgotten how to notice, who had discovered that true success meant building something worthy of the trust others placed in you. She thought about Emily's note, "Broken things can be fixed," and smiled. Some things, once broken and mended, became stronger than they had ever been before.